Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Cody Moser. He's a PhD candidate and Fletcher Jones Fellow in the Department of Cognitive and Information Sciences at UC Merced, and a 2024 Junior Fellow at the Institute for Humane Studies. And today we're going to talk about topics like collective intelligence, cultural innovation, infant-directed speech, music, and some other related topics. So Cody, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thanks, Ricardo. Really happy to be here. I love this show, and so really excited to be on.
Thank you. So let's start with intelligence here. First of all, perhaps a definition. What is intelligence?
Yeah, so this is sort of a million-dollar question in the sense that I think everyone has an opinion about it, and there might be kind of a short answer and a long answer that I could give for this. So the short answer, I think, is that intelligence has something to do with problem solving. So it's an ability of an individual or some kind of group to solve a problem, but not only just solve a problem, but solve it in a certain way. We don't tend to use problem solving and intelligence interchangeably. And so you could view intelligence in some way as the ability to solve problems efficiently, maybe as a scalar principle. Sort of a longer version of this, which is my personal view of trying to bring together different kinds of algorithms, everything from, say, human minds to things like natural selection, is that intelligence probably has in terms of the way that you can solve problems. So the first one is the ability of a system to generate solutions for some kind of problem. So there's this generative mechanism. And then the second one is the ability to select from those solutions that have been generated some kind of candidate solution that does better than others in that problem set. And then the third part you can think about is the ability to then entrench or learn from this solution and be able to improve upon it in some way. And so this is a kind of candidate notions view of intelligence. I think one that Margaret Bowden discusses a little bit in some of her work. And I think that does a good job of capturing what's intelligent about, say, the babbling behavior of infants and some of the underlying algorithmic processes for things like gradient descent that you see in machine learning.
So that is about intelligence in general, but what is collective intelligence?
Yeah, so this is another, version of a question where you can have a lot of answers. So it's a bit like, an idea of complex systems in that you can have different kinds of answers to it. But to me, collective intelligence is kind of a view towards the process I just described, but carried out on a population level. So it's how multiple parts come together to produce some kind of an intelligent output. So instead of just viewing intelligence from the output level as coming from a unitary system, it's kind of a mechanistic view of how separate parts of a system or even interacting systems are able to generate intelligent behavior on the whole.
In one of your papers, you argue that intelligence across different domains, and you refer to, for example, the behavior of groups of non-human animals, multicellular organisms, brains, small groups of humans, cultures, and even evolution itself, that intelligence across all of these domains is collective intelligence. Could you explain that?
Yeah, sure. So in that paper, which was titled "All Intelligence is Collective Intelligence," kind of a title I think about sometimes, but that followed from a workshop called the Diverse Intelligences Summer Institute that I attended a couple of years ago, where we sat down to think about different forms of intelligence, from AI to infants to primates to people themselves. And me and the group that I was working with kind of came to the conclusion that for virtually any system that exhibits intelligent behavior, when you start describing its generating mechanisms, so what is it that actually puts together that intelligent behavior, you can break these mechanisms down into interactions of different parts. And so such that, these mechanisms can be unified via describing them as a collective system. So, for example, if you think about the production of a unitary mind, which you and I have, this is generated by a collective we call the brain, which itself is comprised of neurons. And the important thing that we propose in that paper is that if it really is the case that you can break these input-output relationships down in such a way, and think about it in terms of the interaction of these different parts, then there might be some kind of set of unifying processes or laws underlying what describes the behavior of, say, swarms of insects and what describes the behavior of mind. Unfortunately, in that paper, we don't really get into what some of these unifying processes are, or tell anyone how these systems obviously do differ, which they do. I mean, the brain is obviously different from a flock of starlings. But kind of in some recent work, we've been following up on this, and we've developed something like a good system for distinguishing between these systems. So one way that you could think about the way that collective systems process information in terms of the mechanism is that on one level, you have how individuals process information about the group around them. So me thinking about my group members, birds keeping track of what the other birds in the population are doing, and so on and so forth. This is something that comes from an individual's rule sets. It can be tightly constrained, as in the case of neurons, right? They're not going to simply necessarily form new axons to talk to other new neurons in different parts of the brain, versus, birds can dynamically reconfigure their groups. And then the other one that is not necessarily the agent rule set is how sensitive the outcomes in the group are to the structural rearrangement of the group. So if I were to take a bird flock and I were to chop it in half, would it behave qualitatively different? Would the two parts be doing different things? Certain philosophers like William Wimsatt argues, well, not necessarily. Or actually he argues, yes, a little bit they would be doing the same thing. But say if you do something like you rearrange parts of the brain, is it going to produce different kinds of outcomes? And I think in that case, the answer is a clear yes. And so you can start thinking about different kinds of collectives in terms of how sensitive the individuals are, and then how sensitive the group level information is to the arrangement of those individuals in its own set. But that's developing work that's going to take a long time to formalize, but I think that's one way that we can start thinking about breaking down these processes between different kinds of collectives.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, since if, according to what you argue here, if all of these systems, all the intelligence that we find in all of these systems is collective intelligence, is there such a thing as individual intelligence?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there has to be, right? So on some level. So, in the brain, there are particular units, right? I mean, there are neurons which themselves seem to be bounded little organisms in a way that have their own rule sets. They have their own boundary separating them from other individuals. And I think that when you start trying to draw these boundaries, it really depends on the scale of the system that you're looking at. So, for example, humans are certainly individuals in light of the larger collectives that we're in. When, your boss in a company gives you a task, he's not giving part of your brain a task. He's giving you as a gestalt individual some kind of a task. So, depending on the task, I think you can argue that there are individuals in the world on some level, but it really depends on what level you're looking at. And something that's really important is that it's important to distinguish between, say, the goals on these different levels between one another. So What I mean by that is that if you think about, say, what's going on in my brain versus what's going on coming out of my mouth, in terms of my unitary cognition, these different levels might have totally different goals that are in some way orthogonal from one another. So, right now I'm talking to you. I'm trying to produce. Hopefully, I'm producing some coherent thoughts. But on the other hand, what are my neurons doing? My neurons necessarily don't care about that process. What they care about is getting some level of electrical feedback from the other neurons around them. Their ultimate goal is its survival as these little metabolic creatures. And so when you're distinguishing between what happens on multi-scale collective intelligences and between what happens between an individual and a group, it's very important, I think, to think about different goals in these systems. And that might be one way of distinguishing between what's happening, what constitutes a group and what constitutes an individual.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk now a little bit about culture and some cultural phenomena here. First of all, what is cultural innovation?
Yeah, so you can think about cultural innovation as, say, the production of novel cultural ideas or concepts in a system which interacts with learning and human intelligence in some way. So if we think for a moment about what culture is something like an information lineage which a group of people or animals, or I think eventually there will be a machine culture, shares together. And innovation in these systems is when an invention arises, on the part of one individual or between individuals, and it ends up getting adopted by the rest of the group. And so a cultural innovation can be everything from a piece of technology, like your cell phone or your writing pad, like I'm using, or something, to a piece of music or something that you're wearing. So it can be something that's fitness dependent, has some kind of role in fitness, and then things which are kind of orthogonal to fitness, such as say certain styles of clothing that people wear, where that kind of correspondence between this cultural innovation and what it's doing for us as organisms is not so clear.
How can we study cultural innovation then, and the kinds of social networks that facilitate or accelerate it?
Yeah, so this is, most of my research looks at the relationship between structure and cultural innovation. So the most common way that we do it now is we use models of some type. And so you can basically construct a model either in the form of an experiment. Experiments are models because what a model does is it isolates parts of some system that you're thinking about, at least the parts that you think are important, and then tries to see how these things work together. If you have a model of a skeleton, well, that's not actually the skeletal system of a human, but it shows all of the important underlying features, such as where the joints are and whatnot. And so when we're doing experiments trying to understand cultural innovation, when we're building models, I particularly use agent-based models, where basically what you do is you create some kind of computational algorithm where you have individuals who have their own little rule sets. You have them interact with each other, and then you put them on different kinds of structures. In my case, generally what I do is I interact them with networks, where you can basically represent structures as people talking to each other. So I might talk to you, you and I might talk to some of the same people, but then there are also people that you've talked to and people I have talked to who differ. And so we kind of form a network off of that, and we can basically examine these networks in terms of their different features. And then using agent-based models, what we can do is we can tie these different kinds of network structures or features to different kinds of performances and different agent-based modeling tasks. Another way that we can kind of explore cultural innovation is directly by, say, looking at how different traits emerge, say, in, for example, the patent literature, where people will look at who cites who when they're coming up with a patent, under what conditions do patents emerge. In the new field of science, which is in many ways the study of citation networks, people can look at where it is radical innovations, ones that tend to have more citations than others, arise. Is it the case that these arise in places where people have similar thoughts or different thoughts? Does the institutional structure of different universities tend to, say, affect rates of scientific output in some situations? And so in my case, the kinds of models that I build is you'll have agents that together have to solve some kind of complex task. And you can think about this complex tasks as saying, we're trying to find the highest peak on a landscape. And the landscape is comprised of different mountains or hills where if I'm in a valley, I can't really see mountains that are beyond the ones that are immediately around me. But what we can do is we can kind of split up the population, search together, and speak to one another to see exactly what kinds of structural systems allow for better innovation, allow for us to find this kind of global optimum in a system.
Is it also possible, or do you study cultural innovation experimentally with participants, with groups of people culturally innovating in some, I would imagine, relatively small ways, but do you also do that?
I haven't done that myself. This is kind of an area I really like to get into, but one of my main models is one called the potions task, which was based off of a paper by Maxime Derricks and Robert Boyd in 2016, where what they had was they had a system where individuals were brought together into groups. And the task was that if I give you a set of 6 potions, say like a long blue one, a short orange one, et cetera, and tell you, you can mix these in certain ways to produce new potions, and then use those subsequent potions to then make even more types of potions or combinations. What groups are going to produce the best set of potions? And what was really brilliant about that experiment is that what they did was they kind of made it so that at the beginning of the experiment, when you had these 6 potions, if you mix them one certain way, you would get kind of a new potion and a certain set of outputs. And if you mix them a different certain way, you would get a different kind of potion and a certain set of outputs. And so what they did was they had 2 treatments. In one treatment, they had a group of 6 people who they would mix together their own potions. And then after each step, they could see what everyone else had produced. So I could see what you had come up with. You could see what I had come up with. And in the other group, what they did was they had 3 groups of 2 people where, say, I could see what you mixed, you could see what I mixed, but then we couldn't see the other groups. And then every few steps, they would let the groups kind of see what each other had done. And what they found is that differing between this group where everyone can see what everyone does, and then the other one where they only have a limited time window on seeing what other folks do, is that none of the groups where everyone could see what everyone was doing was able to basically find both of these independent solutions and then basically discover the full item set. This full item set basically made you find solution set 1 and solution set 2, like you had 2 different tech trees. While as in the split group, where everyone could every once in a while see what the others were doing, I think over 60% of those folks completed the task by basically finding both trajectories and then mixing the solutions at the top and getting this like super potion where you like win the game. And so what I've done is I've turned that into an agent-based model, where now what you can do is you can run that simulation basically using the exact same rule set that the individual experiments have. You can recapture their findings, where you have a fully connected group and they tend to get stuck either on one trajectory or the other. We have a partially connected group. What ends up happening is most of the time they tend to complete the task within a certain amount of time. And then what you can do, because it's hard to do this experiment, is you can kind of scale this up. You can do populations of hundreds or thousands of agents. Usually I stick to below 100 for a task like this. You can alter the kinds of structures, so you can do different kinds of networks. So for example, I made like a citation network of everyone in my department who works with one another or has co-authored a paper. And to this day, it's still the best performing group I've ever found in this task. So you can throw all kinds of different structures on it, everything from chimpanzee networks, which surprisingly don't tend to innovate very well. Or maybe that's not surprising, but it tells you something about chimpanzee social systems and the way that information is transmitted through them, to more complex networks.
So I would like to understand a little bit more about the different kinds of social networks that are studied and to what extent they facilitate or accelerate cultural innovation. So could you tell us about three different kinds of structure of social networks that I have here? The first one is decentralized core periphery, the second centralized core periphery, and the third one affinity network structure. Tell us about them.
Yeah, so this is from a paper I did with my collaborator at the Army Research Labs, Jesse Miltzman, where we were trying to figure out if modular versus non-modular structures affect performance very well. So the difference between these is that a core periphery network is overall a network that has a distinguished core, which is tightly connected to itself, and a periphery that is less connected to itself or less connected to the core. And so these three types of networks is you have a centralized core periphery, which is basically where you have a core that is well connected to itself. You have a periphery that's well connected to itself, and then they're relatively connected to each other. You have decentralized core periphery. And so this is a situation where you have a core that's very much connected to itself. You have a periphery that is less connected to itself, and the two are less connected to each other, such that you maximize what I call these kind of peripheral loser nodes. These are nodes in the system that are really not connected to anyone. It doesn't seem that they're connected to the center of the network. They're not really connected to the rest of the periphery of the network. And then what you have is affinity networks, which are modular networks, where basically the core and the periphery are equally connected to themselves, and they're loosely connected to each other. And so you could think about these different networks using examples from the exact same system, which is the human brain. So the decentralized core periphery network is like the difference between your gray and white matter. So the difference between a lot of the brain and then your cortex. One is, this kind of tightly clustered core, and then the rest is kind of extensive, less connected periphery. The centralized core peripheries, like the thalamus and the cortex, where the thalamus is hugging and kind of connected to the rest of the cortex, but the cortex is still kind of decentralized from itself. And then in terms of the affinity modular networks, you can think about it like the left and right hemisphere of the brain, where they're kind of equivalent in terms of their structure, and they're loosely connected to each other.
Okay, and which one of them tends to accelerate cultural innovation the most, and how?
So what we found in that paper is that, so going back real quick, so one of the reasons that this works well is because or that any of these systems might work well is that they are limiting the connectivity of the network, which means that a lot of independent conversations are going on within each of these networks. So you can think about an affinity network as like two different rooms where two separate conversations can take place. And then by loosely linking to each other, those two conversations can kind of talk to one another. So in a network where everyone is talking to each other, what ends up happening is the same opinion tends to fixate. Everyone tends to say the same things, but what you end up getting is that whatever opinion fixates fast. So these fully connected networks are really rapid in terms of how they can basically exploit information. And we talk about this in terms of kind of an exploration-exploitation trade-off, where in exploration, what you're doing is you're trying to generate or find novel solutions. And in exploitation, what you're doing is you're using what you have and building upon it rapidly. So you could think about this landscape analogy that I gave earlier. In a system of exploration, what's happening is we're trying to find different hills. In exploitation, what we're doing is we found a hill and we're going to run up it as fast as possible. And so affinity networks work really well because what they do is they maximize the system of exploration between two groups. But what we found is that the decentralized core periphery networks, out of all the simulated networks I've tested, tend to do particularly well. And the reason why is that they're balancing this exploration exploitation trade-off in two ways. What they have on one level is this core, which is receiving information from the periphery such that the periphery is kind of shielded from the behavior of the core. They're able to keep on exploring in this landscape, but then they send that information to the core, and the core is able to basically rapidly adapt to anything that the periphery gives them. And we find this in our paper in terms of these agent-based models of cultural innovation, but other folks have talked about this in the past. So Ernst Mayr has talked about what are some of the idealized populations that you might find for adaptation and population genetics. And he says, due to the effects of population swamping, where large populations or population units can overwrite any of the variability in smaller ones, he says these kinds of core periphery networks where you have one large core and then kind of multiple subpopulations that are shielded off from it on the periphery would be really good for fixating biological adaptations. We also see these in the human brain. So Danny Bassett had a paper at the University of Pennsylvania, had a paper a few years ago where what they found is that learning networks in the brain, if you look at, for example, how different functional networks behave as you're learning some kind of a complex task, ones that exhibit this decentralized core periphery trade-off tend to exhibit faster learning dynamics. And you can think about it in a way that if you're learning the piano and you're trying to learn a new skill in the piano, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to be able to preserve some of your core competencies, right? If I'm trying something new, I don't want to rewrite everything else that I've done. But I do want to be able to explore a little bit to basically figure out, okay, can I integrate this into my, you could say like core learning module or something like that. I use module in a different way. And what we find is that this has a massive influence on learning. So everywhere from population genetics to learning in the brain, this kind of decentralized core periphery system seems to have an influence on the ability to both explore novel solutions and exploit basically what you've learned.
You have also done some work on factors that play a role in innovation, including population size, connectivity, and agent behavior. Could you explain each of them and how they actually play a role in innovation?
Yeah, so we can start with population size. This is one that you often hear about. Say, if we just had more people, we would just, have even more nice things, for example, in economics and so on and so forth. And the idea here is that population size allows you to have more innovation. So starting in a paper by Joseph Henrich, looking at what he called the Tasmania case, he built a model trying to understand how is it that, well, what he was trying to understand was he was trying to understand when Tasmania separated from mainland Australia, why did they lose a number of complex cultural traits? So they lost, for example, it seems, the ability to fish. They lost the ability to form certain kinds of textiles. One citation says that certain areas of Tasmania lost the ability to make fire, although it's not clear whether that's true. But the point is that what Joe did in his model was he imagined a system where you have a population of learners, and the learners are trying to learn from the best person in their population. So I'm in a room and we're all making paper airplanes, and there's just one guy who's like, you know, his airplane is going 30 meters every time that he throws this thing. And it's like, okay, I need to copy this. What he has is there's a little bit of noise, which is the error rate of copying someone, because, you know, if I'm copying someone's paper airplane, I'm not going to be able to do it perfectly. And what he found is that large populations are able to maintain the necessary amount of variance to basically cumulatively learn, meaning that some people are able to learn better than the best learner in the population. Now, what I found is that, and this has kind of been reformed in recent years, finding that different factors are more important. What I found is that population size is good, but the amount of work that a population has to do, say between 100 individuals and 1,000 individuals, is basically equivalent. So they have to do the same amount of work to get the same kind of stuff in the process. So you could see a small population catching up to a large population if you gave them, say, the same number of iterations that lets 100 people do the same amount of work as 1,000 people. In recent years, what's been emphasized more is connectivity. So what connectivity grants you is it grants you the ability to preserve some of this variance in the population. So by shielding off the groups from one another, what you get is the ability of one group to explore one thing, another group to explore another thing. So you can hold population size constant, but if you structure the population a certain way, making it less connected rather than more connected, it's as if you have more individuals in that group. And this is related to a concept from biology called effective population size. And effective population size is more or less a measure of the variance in the population. So it's saying, you know, if everyone believes this exact same thing, it's as if you have one person. Even if you have 100 people, it comes out that your effective population size is 1 if the trait is the same for everyone. But as you start to structure the group differently, what you end up getting is a maintenance of this variation. And Joe talks about this at the end of his paper, where he says, well, maybe it's the case that what mattered more in the Tasmanian case is their connectivity rather than their population size. So to give credit to that paper, this is discussed in it. And then the last one is agent behavior, and these are the rule sets. So what is it that the agents themselves can do? So oftentimes, if you look in, for example, a neural network, the agents, if you think about the nodes in a neural network as an agent, they really can't do much. They can kind of transform the information that's given to them and then pass it on to the next node. Versus in more complex models, agents can think about what information are they receiving from their neighbors. They can judge it based on whether or not the agents have some kind of group value, say in-group versus out-group distinctions. They can switch neighbors and so on and so forth. And all of these play different factors in terms of determining whether or not you're going to have more innovation in a population or not.
What is the role played by individuals in innovation?
Yeah, this is a great question. So one thing is that in this kind of field of collective intelligence or collective problem solving, Mostly what we've tended to focus on is how the group needs to be structured to solve some kind of problem, right? So we say, oh, this kind of network is good for simple tasks. This kind of network is good for complex tasks. Turns out simple networks, ones that are fully connected, are good for simple tasks where everything is known, and more complex tasks require this division. But oftentimes what we don't ask is, what is it that the agents inside are doing? And I think that what you can think about is what individuals are doing in innovation is kind of two things. One is that they are generating the novel solutions for the rest of the population, right? So I'm coming up with new ideas. I'm giving them to my friends and so on and so forth, hoping that they fix in the population. People start using my ideas for things. But on the other hand, what's really critical is, where is this person positioned, right? So if you had Isaac Newton and, he was just writing to 2 or 3 people, none of which were in some broader situated network, it really wouldn't matter what he was doing. And so the other thing that individuals do is they tend to direct or focus information flow in certain ways. And so in terms of individuals and their feedback in terms of innovation, there's a trade-off. So there's both what people can do in terms of their individual abilities, and then where they are situated. And that really governs their impact on what happens on the system level. So it's important both in terms of, individual intelligence, and for the group intelligence, where that individual intelligence is placed.
When it comes to innovation facilitating networks, do they create inequality? And what does inequality mean in this kind of context? And what are genius effects?
Yeah. Something that I've been referring to a lot is the role that variance or diversity plays in innovation. And this is really, really important. So going back to the biologist R.A. Fisher, Fisher had this idea, which was the fundamental theorem of natural selection. And what the fundamental theorem said was that the strength of selection in a population is equivalent to the amount of variance that it has. So selection basically needs diversity in order to operate. My advisor, Paul Smaldino, and I wrote a paper on this idea of transient diversity for accelerating cultural innovation. And what transient diversity is it's just saying any mechanism which increases this diversity on a system level will tend to improve the behavior of that system. Now, the downside to that means that, okay, let's assume that there's some kind of right or wrong answer that the agents are moving towards, right? The downside is that some agents, therefore, are necessarily going to be more right than others. And so what we found in our paper is that the proportion to which a population increases its performance due to this diversity also proportionally increases the inequality in that system. So that diversity comes with almost a built-in trade-off for inequality. And this inequality you can think about is in terms of solutions generated. So we have a system like, we spoke about Isaac Newton a moment ago, right? Someone who clearly was a genius. But we can think about him in light of the other people that he was around. And so we could say that in systems where you tend to have better and better solutions, you'll tend to have more inequality in them.
So changing topics now, what is cumulative cultural evolution and how is it studied?
Yeah, so cumulative cultural evolution is basically the process by which novel innovations end up getting fixed in a population. They get thrown into its memory, and this is very important. And then they can be improved upon generation by generation. And the difference between cultural evolution and cumulative cultural evolution is that the traits which are present in cumulative cultural evolution get improved upon over time, rather than being forgotten. So we have different kinds of cultural evolution which are not cumulative. Like, it doesn't seem that chimps which transmit information tend to reliably improve upon that information and then transmit those improvements through time. One thing that I've discussed with some colleagues recently is you can think about maybe games that children play. So I find this example very interesting, which is that there are certain traits that are maintained at that kind of lower demographic level that represent some of the same games that you played and I played and our parents played through time. They were simply transmitted by kids of certain generations. So the older kids taught the younger kids, so on and so forth. But those games didn't change. Hide and seek, tag, all these things remain the same. They didn't get improved upon over time, but nevertheless, they were transmitted. And so that's the difference, is the ability for this transmitted trait to get improved upon or not.
So you have also studied infant-directed speech. First of all, what is it? What is it characterized by, particularly in comparison to other kinds of speech?
Yeah, so infant-directed speech is something that many groups of humans do. Maybe all groups of humans do. We can discuss that if you want later. Where basically it's a special characterized version of speech that is just for infants. It's a signal that infants hear, and they know that this signal is for them. It's differentiated from the types of speech and language that we use for adults. And it's a way of saying, hey, I'm paying attention to you. I'm not paying attention to other people right now. This signal is specifically to let you know that I'm talking to you. And so oftentimes it's characterized by a higher pitch than adult-directed speech is. There's more exploration in what we call vowel space. So vowels are formed basically by the two first waves of the harmonic series in the human voice. And the ratio of these first two series, which we call formants, determine what vowel you can hear or what vowel you're producing in space. And so you get this triangle, this vowel triangle. And what we find is that in infant-directed speech, there's more exploration in this triangle than in adult-directed speech. It's less rough, and it tends to have overall clearer tones than adult-directed speech.
And is it a human universal? I mean, does it occur in every society studied up till now, or not?
Yeah, so I used to have to be very careful about this, but I think recently I'm more willing to say that as far as possible human universals go, and specifically ones that don't have linguistic content, I think infant-directed speech is one of the clearer ones. It's one of the closest things we have to a non-linguistic universal. So in our study, what we did was we basically had people, we sent anthropologists and psychologists to different field sites around the world. We had them record people speaking, singing to their infants and speaking and singing to adults. And then we looked at these acoustic features just to see if there was some kind of fingerprint that you could identify distinguishing infant-directed speech from adult-directed speech. And it seemed in all of these cases that was the case. Now, there were some ethnographies back in the 1970s and 80s, specifically, I think, in Samoa and among the Kaluli in Papua New Guinea, arguing that there was not infant-directed speech. But I really like those papers because I think what they actually show is that there is a cultural diversity to the way that infant-directed speech is enacted. So if I'm remembering correctly, in the Kaluli case, people simply don't speak to infants. it's just kind of a cultural rule. But interestingly enough, when an infant is present, what they do is they'll put the infant on their lap, and then they'll speak in that high pitch, clear tone voice to other adults as if the infant is speaking. So it's as if that infant-directed speech stimulus is present, nevertheless, but in a different cultural context, which tells me that there is something being elicited, mechanistically in some way to produce this, even if the cultural context has differed.
Are people able to identify infant-directed speech in other languages that they do not speak themselves?
Yeah. So what we did in our study was we did a giant, massive online experiment. I think we had like 10,000 participants from most internet access countries around the world. And what we found is that people do reliably characterize infant-directed speech from adult-directed speech. So I think that for infant-directed speech vocalizations, I think something like 60 to 70% were classified as being infant-directed. And for adult-directed speech, only something like 30% were classified as infant-directed. So on both ends, there was really high ability of people to distinguish whether or not this speech was for a baby or whether or not it was for an adult. So it seems that these acoustic signatures, whatever they may be, and there may be more complex ones than the ones that we found in the paper, although most of the work is mediated by pitch alone. People can usually just tell by pitch, whether that's through the pitch being higher or for the pitch curves being different is something to be explored. They can tell basically distinguishing based on the pitch whether or not this signal is for baby or whether it's for an adult.
Is there anything that we can learn more broadly about human communication by studying these infant-directed speech?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing about the study of human communication is that it gets caught up in language. And language and speech are not the same thing. Language is that kind of, it is verbal, it's this logical process too. It's very cognitively demanding. It has its own set of almost Platonic rules to it that are independent from the act of speaking. It's the reason why you and I can look at a piece of paper and communicate with each other that way. Well, as infant-directed speech asks you pretty directly, besides just transmitting, facts about the external world, what is the purpose of communication? By looking at infant-directed speech, I think we can ask some of the most basic things about what communication is about. We can ask, what are the basic units that we're trying to communicate with each other? What is the minimal communicative unit? What is it that we're actually trying to do together when we're talking? I think in terms of infant-directed speech, one of the more interesting things is that a lot of our language has this kind of dark matter that we call prosody. It's, my voice is going up and down when I'm talking to you. I have a certain kind of rhythm that's moving around as I'm communicating. And prosody is almost entirely what's going on in the case of infant-directed speech. There's very little being transmitted verbally to a baby. I am trying to teach the baby. I'm saying, oh, is this color blue? Oh, it's blue. But really what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get the infant's attention via that prosodic means. And so looking at infant-directed speech allows us to understand prosody while isolating it from language. And it's one of the reasons that this kind of infant-directed speech might change across the lifespan, which is that early on what we're doing is we're trying to get the baby's attention, whereas later on what we're trying to do is we're trying to teach. And then eventually adult-directed speech is just about pure efficiency in terms of communicating statements about the world. So they are very different, but a lot of the mechanisms driving the kind of speech that you and I are doing right now have to be present in that infant-directed speech as well.
So there's one last topic I would like to ask you about. We've just talked about speech. How about music? What counts as music, and what can we learn by studying it?
Yeah, music is is kind of a hard one because, defining music in a way that captures, I think, some of the human specific properties versus like what's done in birds and other things is somewhat difficult. But one way I think that we can think about music is that uh, it's a, you could say, non-linguistic or even pre-linguistic way of regularly patterning our rhythm and pitch. Music, it's generally thought, had some kind of social function when it emerged. But now, in many parts, you and I can listen to music independently, such that this patterning of rhythm and pitch is something that we can kind of enjoy on our own now. There are some neural mechanisms, driving it. I think that have gone kind of independent of its original functions.
And what are the functions of music, actually?
Oh yeah, so this is all over the place. So in infants, we kind of have a good idea, which is, you could separate, say, play songs from lullabies. So a lullaby has a kind of soothing function for an infant. It's something that's trying to calm them down, trying to break up some of the loudness in the world to kind of, bring the infant back to kind of a more pure, less aroused state. Well, let's say infant directed speech is something that's trying to raise an infant's arousal and attention. On the other hand, certain kinds of music serve explicit social functions, right? So dance songs seem to allow people to entrain to one another. There's kind of neural entrainment where our brains start doing some of the same things. There's movement entrainment where we start moving in the same ways for music. Some of this is thought maybe to have emerged with, and this gets into kind of just so story territory, but some of it is thought to maybe emerge with, say, group boundaries. So if you look at, for example, TD monkeys or other types of monogamous primates, they tend to have these music-like territorial calls where you find this in injuries and lemurs. They'll have certain kinds of melodic matching, which you generally don't find in too many animals, but you do find it sometimes in primates that are trying to distinguish territorial bounds with one another. But overall, this function is something that's been captured by group selection such that it's given us all kinds of different functions, right? So we might have the function of singing to our baby. We might have the function of this kind of drawing boundaries, but there's also songs that we have for healing. There's the kind of songs that you might hear at church. Steven Pinker has this cheesecake hypothesis where, it's like asking what's the evolutionary purpose of cheesecake? And he says, well, maybe it had a purpose, but also it's just something that we enjoy. And so you can think about cultural evolution and group selection as basically capturing this system which, works on a neural level for many reasons that originally may be different from what we have today, and then is able to expand on it in all kinds of different ways. So we have music for learning now. We have music for healing, so on and so forth.
So one last question then. What explains the diversity of human songs? And at least in one of your papers that I read, you talk about mechanisms like group selection and cultural niche construction. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so in these cases, what you're getting is that this kind of messy general purpose system is getting repurposed in all kinds of different ways. And in the context of group selection or cultural niche construction, you can think about songs or different genres and such differentiating among different kinds of identity or group types. So, for example, I might want to differentiate myself from one group over another. So what we end up doing is we create a more exaggerated kind of song that's very different from other kinds of song. Music seems to separate among ethnicity, among class. It separates among just simple, you have people who are punk rockers and people who are metalheads that are forming both an identity around music and using that music as something of a boundary. There's a reason why certain kinds of music might be appealing to you or I, and certain kinds might be disappealing. And a lot of that might have something to do with your role in a group, your exposure over time. You listen to these things, and then you start developing a certain kind of taste that pulls you off in one direction over the other, and allows you to form different kinds of cultural groups.
Great. So where can people find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, so I think I'm still most active on X, formerly Twitter. My handle is LTF_01. I have a website, culturologies.co, where you can download pretty much all of my papers. I've written a lot for different public outlets, and all my things are either uploaded or linked to on my website. And yeah, I think that would be the easiest way.
Great. So I will be leaving links to that in the description of the interview. And Cody, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been fun to talk to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ricardo. I was glad to come on.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Kossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.